The file was never meant to be opened. For nearly a century, the image of Vladimir Lenin was carved in stone, a revolutionary icon, a political architect, a man whose identity seemed fixed, documented, unquestioned. His speeches were archived, his letters preserved, his body embalmed. History, it appeared, had sealed him in certainty. And then a group of genetic researchers decided to test something no historian had ever been able to verify. They didn't begin with ideology. They didn't begin with politics. They began with DNA. What they found did not match the myth. What they found did not match the simplified biography taught for generations. And what they found forced a deeply uncomfortable question. Who was Lenin really? Because when fragments of his biological lineage were re-examined through modern genetic methods, the results suggested that the bloodline of one of the most influential revolutionaries in modern history was far more complex and far more unexpected than anyone had publicly acknowledged. For decades, Lenin's ancestry had been described in neat, controlled terms. Russian, educated, intellectual, a product of imperial society who turned against it. That narrative was clean, politically manageable, convenient. But bloodlines are rarely convenient. Behind official documents were erased surnames. Behind state-approved biographies were fragmented family records. Behind patriotic simplifications were whispers about mixed origins, minority ancestry, and suppressed genealogical branches that did not align with the ideological purity later projected onto him. Modern genetic analysis doesn't care about political comfort. It tracks inheritance patterns. It traces mitochondrial lines. It studies paternal markers that travel silently through generations. And when researchers began reconstructing the extended lineage of Lenin's family, not through propaganda, not through memoirs, but through biological data tied to preserved relatives and archived records, something shifted. The story widened. His maternal lineage alone opened a door few had seriously examined. While official biographies acknowledged a blend of Russian, German, and possibly Swedish ancestry, deeper genealogical reconstructions revealed additional threads that had long been politically sensitive in Imperial Russia, and later, inconvenient for Soviet mythmaking. Some branches connected to families that had converted religions generations earlier. Others traced back to regions outside the core Slavic heartland. Names that had once appeared in parish registries were later modified, translated, or quietly adapted. None of this was entirely unknown to specialists, but it had never been emphasized. And emphasis matters in history, because Lenin was not just a man. He was constructed into a symbol, a distilled embodiment of revolutionary identity. Symbols are streamlined, nuances removed. Genetics reintroduces nuance. When paternal lines were compared across extended relatives, markers indicated Central European inheritance patterns more strongly than many had assumed. On the maternal side, archived evidence pointed toward minority ancestry that had been minimized in Soviet-era texts. To be clear, this did not rewrite Lenin's ideology. It did not suddenly transform his political philosophy, but it disrupted the simplicity of the narrative. And simplicity is powerful. Why does this matter? Because for generations, Lenin was presented as a product of a singular national essence, the voice of a unified proletarian destiny. Yet his ancestry reflected something far more layered: cross-cultural intersections, borderland migrations, adaptive identities shaped by the fluid realities of the Russian Empire. The irony is striking. A man who would later attempt to engineer a new social order, categorizing, restructuring, redefining identity, emerged from a lineage that resisted clean categorization. Historians who revisited family documents after genetic cross-referencing found overlooked inconsistencies in earlier biographical accounts, dates that didn't align perfectly, geographic transitions that had been simplified, religious affiliations that shifted between generations. And then there were the names. Surnames altered to blend in, middle names adjusted, records translated differently depending on the political climate of the era in which they were published. When you trace bloodlines far enough, you often discover survival strategies embedded within them. Imperial Russia was not a stable identity machine. It was a vast, multi-ethnic empire where families adapted to avoid discrimination, secure positions, or integrate socially. And Lenin's ancestors appear to have done exactly that. This is not scandal in the sensational sense. It is more subtle, and perhaps more unsettling, because it reminds us that history's most rigid ideologies often emerge from deeply hybrid origins. In the early 20th century, ancestry could determine opportunity. It could determine suspicion. It could determine loyalty. To downplay certain roots was strategic. Soviet historiography later inherited those strategic silences. But DNA doesn't negotiate with ideology. The research did not reveal a secret lineage that contradicts everything known. It did something more powerful. It exposed how incomplete the story had been. It showed that the revolutionary who sought to reshape national identity was himself the descendant of overlapping identities, Slavic, Central European, minority threads interwoven through centuries of movement and adaptation. For some historians, this was not shocking. For others, it was destabilizing. Because once you acknowledge complexity in origin, you must acknowledge complexity in legacy. And Lenin's legacy has rarely been treated as complex. He is hero or villain, architect or destroyer, visionary or tyrant. But genetically, biologically, he was neither pure symbol nor singular archetype. He was human, and human lineages are messy. In private academic circles, the discussion grew louder. Why had certain genealogical nuances been footnoted rather than foreground? Why had earlier Soviet biographers streamlined maternal ancestry descriptions? Why were some parish records referenced vaguely rather than directly? The answers point not to conspiracy in the cinematic sense, but to narrative control. Nations curate memory. Revolutions curate founders. But science, when applied without ideological pressure, reopens archives. And once opened, they don't always close neatly. This is where the story becomes more intriguing, because the genetic conversation does not end with ethnicity percentages or migration maps. It intersects with a deeper question. How much of what we think we know about iconic figures is shaped by selective storytelling? If Lenin's ancestry could be streamlined for symbolic clarity, how many other historical biographies have been quietly simplified? And what else would modern genetic tools reveal if applied widely across the past? The revelation is not that Lenin wasn't Russian. That is a distortion. The revelation is that identity, even at the level of blood, is rarely singular. And that fact challenges ideological absolutism more than any political argument ever could. As researchers continue analyzing extended familial markers, the academic debate grows more nuanced. Some emphasize continuity. Others stress hybridity. None deny complexity. But complexity does something dangerous to myths. It makes them human. And once a myth becomes human, it can no longer stand untouched. To understand why Lenin's ancestry became such a sensitive subject, you have to step back into the world he was born into, the Russian Empire of the late 19th century. It was not a nation in the modern sense. It was a vast, unstable mosaic. Russians, Tatars, Germans, Jews, Poles, Ukrainians, Baltic peoples, Finns, dozens of ethnic and religious groups living under one imperial structure. Identity was not abstract. It was administrative. It was political. It could determine where you lived, what job you held, which schools you could attend, even how closely the state watched you. And in that world, ancestry was never just background information. It was leverage. It was risk. Lenin was born Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov in 1870. His father was a state education official, a respected position. His mother came from a family with documented European roots, including German heritage. Official biographies later described this blend matter-of-factly: a cultured household, educated, disciplined, upwardly mobile. But beneath that surface lay threads that did not fit comfortably into the simplified revolutionary image constructed later. His maternal grandfather, Alexander Blank, had a background that has sparked debate among historians for decades. Archival records suggest he was born into a Jewish family that converted to Russian Orthodoxy. In Imperial Russia, that detail mattered enormously. Conversion could open doors. It could remove legal restrictions. It could allow access to property rights and professional advancement that were otherwise limited. But conversion did not erase memory. And in certain social circles, it did not erase suspicion. For generations, this detail was either minimized or framed cautiously. Soviet historiography acknowledged elements of mixed heritage, but avoided emphasizing anything that might complicate the image of a purely Russian revolutionary leader. In an empire, and later a state, where anti-Semitism had deep historical roots, foregrounding Jewish ancestry could have been politically explosive. Now imagine that fact colliding with modern genetic scrutiny. When researchers revisited extended family trees alongside preserved documentation, they found patterns consistent with a family navigating identity strategically. Conversions, geographic relocations, linguistic shifts, subtle alterations of names across decades. None of this was unusual for the era. What makes it compelling is who the descendant became. Lenin would go on to lead a revolution that sought to dismantle old hierarchies, erase class distinctions, and re-engineer society. Yet his own lineage had been shaped by navigating those very hierarchies, by adapting to them, blending within them, surviving them. There's a tension there that historians are only now discussing more openly. Because if Lenin's family history included Jewish ancestry, even partially, it places him within a demographic that had historically faced discrimination under the Tsarist regime. It complicates the narrative of a purely Russian intellectual rebelling against autocracy from a position of cultural homogeneity. It suggests a family history intertwined with marginalization and integration at the same time. And then there's the German thread. His mother's side included documented German roots, part of the long-standing presence of ethnic Germans within the Russian Empire. These communities often maintained linguistic and cultural distinctiveness while integrating economically. During World War I, German ancestry became politically dangerous within Russia. Suspicion fell on families with German names. Allegiances were questioned. Patriotism scrutinized. Lenin, leading a revolutionary movement during a time of war, could not afford ambiguity in identity. So ambiguity was streamlined. The Soviet state later inherited that streamlined version. But here is where the genetic dimension sharpens the story. Modern ancestry testing doesn't operate in broad cultural labels. It examines haplogroups, markers inherited through paternal and maternal lines. These markers can indicate geographic clustering across centuries. They don't tell you what language your ancestors spoke. They don't tell you what ideology they held. But they do reveal migration. When scholars compared known relatives and extended genealogical branches, the picture aligned with historical records, suggesting Central European ancestry interwoven with Eastern European roots. Not surprising on its own, but powerful when contrasted against the rigid national narratives later promoted. Lenin was presented as the embodiment of proletarian Russia. Yet biologically, he emerged from the crossroads of empire. And here is the uncomfortable twist. The revolution he led would later struggle profoundly with questions of ethnicity, minority identity, and national autonomy. The Soviet Union officially promoted internationalism, yet it also managed and categorized ethnic groups through strict administrative systems. Identity was tracked. Ancestry was recorded. In some cases, it determined fate. The very state structure that emerged after Lenin's death would obsess over lineage in ways eerily reminiscent of the empire it replaced. That irony becomes sharper when you recognize that Lenin's own family story reflected the fluidity of identity in imperial Russia, conversions, cultural blending, educational mobility. It raises a provocative question. Did Lenin's complex heritage influence his ideological emphasis on class over ethnicity? Was his focus on economic structures partly a rejection of the ethnic hierarchies embedded in the world his ancestors navigated? There's no simple answer, but historians increasingly acknowledge that personal background shapes intellectual formation, even when unspoken. And there is something psychologically striking about a revolutionary leader whose lineage included groups historically marginalized within the empire he dismantled. It does not diminish his political responsibility. It does not romanticize his actions. It adds dimension. Dimension unsettles mythology. For decades, Lenin existed in two simplified forms: the saint of Soviet iconography and the villain of anti-communist narratives. Both versions rely on sharp edges and clear outlines. Genetic nuance blurs outlines. It reminds us that identity in the Russian Empire was layered, negotiated, sometimes concealed. And when concealment becomes part of family survival, it often echoes through generations. Some scholars argue that Lenin was fully aware of his ancestry's complexities. Others suggest it was simply background, not central to his political self-understanding. But what cannot be denied is that official biographies carefully curated which aspects were emphasized and which were softened, because revolutionary icons are easier to mobilize when they appear uncomplicated. Yet history is rarely uncomplicated. As more archival documents are digitized and cross-referenced, the academic conversation continues to expand. Parish registries once buried in regional archives are now compared systematically. Family correspondence is analyzed with greater transparency. Genealogical claims, once dismissed as rumor, are re-examined. And what emerges is not scandal, but texture. Texture reveals that Lenin's lineage, like that of millions within the empire, crossed boundaries of religion, language, and ethnicity. It shows adaptation rather than purity, movement rather than isolation. And in doing so, it subtly reframes how we view the man who attempted to redraw the political map of Eurasia. After Lenin's death in 1924, something unusual happened. He did not simply become a historical figure. He became architecture. His face was carved into stone, his name stamped onto cities, his body placed inside a mausoleum as if even decay was not allowed to touch him. The state did not just preserve his legacy, it engineered it. And when a state engineers legacy, it edits. Soviet historiography was not casual biography. It was strategic narrative construction. Lenin had to represent clarity, certainty, direction. He was presented as the logical product of historical inevitability, the embodiment of scientific socialism emerging from Russian soil. Ambiguity did not fit that script. Genealogical complexity did not fit that script. So it was managed. Official biographies acknowledge German ancestry in measured tones. It could be framed as intellectual sophistication, European Enlightenment influence, but elements that were socially sensitive in Tsarist Russia, especially Jewish lineage, were treated cautiously, often relegated to footnotes or described in softened language. Why? Because the Soviet Union inherited a society deeply scarred by anti-Semitism. The Bolsheviks officially condemned ethnic prejudice, yet they operated within a population where centuries of bias did not evaporate overnight. Elevating a revolutionary icon with openly emphasized Jewish ancestry could have triggered political backlash, particularly during periods of instability. At the same time, Lenin needed to symbolize Russian revolutionary authenticity. He was not meant to appear as an outsider or a figure shaped by minority marginalization. He was the voice of the masses, and masses respond to symbols that feel familiar. So the narrative narrowed. This is not unique to Lenin. Nations routinely simplify the origins of their founders. But what makes this case compelling is how carefully the simplification aligned with political needs. In the 1930s, under Stalin, biography became even more rigid. Lenin was canonized as a near-infallible visionary. His personal contradictions were smoothed, his intellectual development streamlined into a straight path toward revolutionary inevitability. Complex ancestry would only introduce unnecessary nuance, and nuance complicates reverence. But here's where the tension deepens. The Soviet state was obsessed with documenting ethnicity internally. Citizens had nationality listed in passports. Ethnic identity was tracked bureaucratically. The regime both downplayed Lenin's complexity and institutionalized ethnic categorization for everyone else. That contradiction is striking. The founder's lineage became abstract and universalized. The population's lineage became recorded and administratively concrete. Why the difference? Because Lenin had to function as a unifying myth. Myths are not designed for genealogical debate. Yet beneath the myth, archival fragments remained. Letters referencing relatives, with altered surnames. Parish documents noting conversions. Regional records showing migration patterns across imperial borders. Individually, each detail was unremarkable. Together, they painted a picture of a family navigating layered identities. And modern historians, freed from ideological pressure, began asking uncomfortable questions. What was intentionally minimized? What was merely overlooked? And what does it mean if the architect of a class-based revolution emerged from a lineage shaped by ethnic negotiation? There's a psychological dimension here that rarely gets discussed. In societies where ancestry affects status, families develop acute awareness of identity management. They learn when to emphasize certain traits and when to quiet others. They understand how names, affiliations, and public presentation influence opportunity. If Lenin grew up within a family that carried such awareness, even subtly, it may have influenced his perception of social structures. He understood, intimately, how systems categorize and rank people, and he rejected those systems. His ideology centered on class as the primary organizing principle. Ethnicity, religion, and heritage were secondary to economic position. That emphasis could be interpreted purely through Marxist theory, but it can also be viewed through personal background. When your own lineage resists clean classification, you may distrust rigid identity hierarchies. Again, this is interpretation, not certainty, but the convergence is difficult to ignore. There's another layer. During the early Soviet years, internal debates emerged about nationality policy. Lenin advocated for a union of republics that acknowledged ethnic diversity while maintaining centralized control. He opposed overt Russian chauvinism within the party. Some scholars now revisit his personal heritage when analyzing these positions. Was his sensitivity to minority concerns purely ideological or partially experiential? We cannot read his DNA for political motives, but we can observe how personal history and political philosophy often intersect. And here is what unsettles traditional narratives most. The myth of Lenin as a singular, purely Russian revolutionary simplifies him into archetype. The reality of his ancestry rehumanizes him, and human figures are unpredictable. He was not the product of a monolithic lineage. He emerged from empire, from conversion, adaptation, educational mobility, and cross-cultural threads. That does not absolve him of responsibility for the consequences of his revolution, but it reframes him. It reminds us that even the architects of rigid systems are born from fluid histories. And when fluid history is hidden beneath rigid ideology, tension accumulates. By the late Soviet period, discussions of Lenin's ancestry became more transparent within academic circles. After the collapse of the USSR, archival access widened dramatically. Historians could examine parish records, cross-check family trees, and speak openly about Jewish and German components of his background without political restraint. The result was not a scandalous revelation. It was normalization. Lenin's ancestry looked like that of many imperial families, blended, adaptive, shaped by migration and conversion. What had once been sensitive became contextual. But here is the larger implication. If the identity of one of the most studied figures in modern history required decades to fully acknowledge its complexity, what does that say about historical biography in general? How many other icons, political, cultural, religious, have had their origins streamlined to serve narrative clarity? How many origin stories are curated rather than complete? Genetics is not rewriting history. It is destabilizing oversimplification. And oversimplification has always been the oxygen of ideology. In the final part, we step back from Lenin himself and confront the broader question his genetic ancestry forces us to face. If even revolutionary myths are built on selective storytelling, how should we approach the identities of the figures who shape our world? Because once you see how origin stories are constructed, you begin to question every monument. And that is where the real revelation begins. In the end, the real shock isn't hidden inside a chromosome. It's hidden inside the story we were told. Lenin's genetic ancestry does not expose a secret dynasty. It does not overturn the revolution. It does not rewrite the 20th century. What it does is far more unsettling. It reveals how easily identity can be sculpted. For over 100 years, Lenin existed as a carefully engineered symbol. In Tsarist records, he was a subject of empire. In Soviet mythology, he was the distilled embodiment of revolutionary Russia. In Western narratives, he became either a mastermind of upheaval or a destroyer of order. In each version, complexity was trimmed, edges were sharpened, origins were simplified. But biology resists simplicity. When modern historians and genealogists reassembled the fragments, migration records, conversion certificates, linguistic shifts, extended family lines, the result was not explosive scandal. It was something more powerful. It was contradiction. The man who helped construct one of the most ideologically rigid systems in modern history came from a lineage shaped by adaptation, by crossing boundaries, by navigating layered identities in an empire obsessed with classification. His ancestors moved between religious worlds. They integrated into different cultural spaces. They altered names. They pursued education as a ladder upward in a stratified society. This was not the story of static identity. It was the story of survival within complexity. And that matters, because revolutionary movements often rely on clear narratives of belonging. They depend on defining who is us and who is them. They draw borders around identity. Yet the bloodline of the revolution's architect refused to stay within borders. That irony lingers. The deeper you examine Lenin's ancestry, the more it mirrors the Russian Empire itself, layered, multi-ethnic, shifting, unstable. And perhaps that is precisely why it was softened in public memory. Myths prefer clean lines. History rarely provides them. But here is where the conversation becomes larger than Lenin. If a figure this scrutinized, this archived, embalmed, monumentalized, required decades before his genealogical texture was openly discussed, what does that suggest about the reliability of historical storytelling? It suggests that every biography operates under pressure. Political pressure, cultural pressure, narrative pressure. Founders must appear coherent. Leaders must appear emblematic. Their origins are often streamlined to support the story a nation needs to tell about itself. In Lenin's case, the Soviet state needed a revolutionary who felt organically Russian, ideologically inevitable, historically pure in purpose. Ambiguity would only complicate that image. So ambiguity was background, and that backgrounding lasted generations. Today, with ideological temperature lowered and archives more accessible, historians can examine these details calmly. Jewish ancestry, German roots, imperial mobility. None of it diminishes Lenin's role in history, but it transforms how we perceive him. He is no longer a carved monument in monochrome. He becomes layered, and layered figures are harder to idolize or demonize in simplistic terms. There's a quiet lesson in that. Identity is never singular. Not in empires, not in revolutions, not in the present. The 20th century was built on rigid ideologies that promised clarity about class, nation, race, destiny. Yet the very architects of those systems often emerged from tangled human histories. Lenin's ancestry reminds us of that tension. It reminds us that behind political certainty lies biological unpredictability. Behind ideological rigidity lies personal complexity. And perhaps that is the most destabilizing revelation of all. Because once you recognize that even the icons were products of mixed inheritance, negotiated identity, and historical contingency, you begin to see monuments differently. You begin to ask, who decides which parts of a life are amplified? Who decides which details are minimized? Who benefits from simplification? In Lenin's case, the answer shifts depending on the era. The Tsarist regime had its own incentives. The Soviet state had others. Cold War narratives layered additional interpretations. Each period curated him differently. Yet his DNA, silent, apolitical, remained unchanged beneath the layers of storytelling. It waited for a century before becoming part of the conversation. And when it entered the conversation, it did not explode. It illuminated. It illuminated how identity is constructed in public memory. It illuminated how states shape founders into usable symbols. It illuminated how even the most powerful historical narratives rest on selective framing. The real surprise historians encountered was not a shocking percentage or an unexpected geographic marker. It was how normal his complexity was. How ordinary it was for a family in the Russian Empire to carry multiple threads of origin. How unnecessary the earlier simplifications now appear. And that normality is what destabilizes myth. Because myths thrive on exceptional purity. Reality thrives on mixture. In the end, Lenin's genetic ancestry does not change what he did. It does not soften the consequences of the revolution. It does not absolve suffering or rewrite political outcomes. What it changes is perspective. It reminds us that the architects of history are human before they are symbols, human before they are statues, human before they are slogans, and humans are never singular. So perhaps the most unsettling discovery was not hidden in the laboratory. It was hidden in the realization that history itself is a curated narrative, and that even the most rigid ideologies are built on fluid origins. Lenin sought to reshape the world, but his own origins were shaped by a world far more intricate than the myth that followed. And once you see that, you can never quite look at the monument the same way again.